Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of the binge-worthy online series Personnel Economics. Now, after talking for 3 classes on employee motivation, today we're going to talk more about selection and recruitment. And I always find these are HR topics that students generally like or prefer more. So today we're going to be talking about economics of recruitment, so the attraction of talented employees, about selection, so how to make a choice out of the applicant pool, but also on how we can avoid bias, so how to avoid discrimination. Because of course there's an ethical dimension involved in recruitment and selection as well. So after today's lecture, I hope you have more idea in what constitutes an optimal hiring strategy and applicant pool. So should we look broad, should we look more narrow, should we look formal, should we look more informal? That you also have a better view of the value of testing potential employees, but also on strategies how bias can be avoided. Because bias, discrimination, there's an ethical reason to do that as an organization, but as we will see, it's also expensive. In the short run, discrimination might sometimes be profitable, but often if you have a very specific preference, that's expensive because you're fishing in a smaller pond, and it would also cost the firm money. So today's class corresponds to chapters 14 to 16 in the book. And since the book is very American, I will also be discussing 2 experiments from Europe on discrimination by Steenbaert. Now, if you're interested, the references are there below for you to read. But I wish to stress they are not obligatory course material, so they're more if you're interested to know more. Okay, so to kick off today, let's talk about recruitment. Let us return to my precious evil empire. So after catching the Jedi in class 2, my evil empire is of course prospering and expanding as never before. But to continue to capitalize on this growth, I will need to hire new employees, so I need new stormtroopers. Now, where will I get those stormtroopers? And there's a couple of possibilities here. So first of all, I can place a job vacancy simply online, on the dark web, of course. So this is formal recruitment. Another thing I could do is I could approach my network of other evil lords and I could ask them if they know suitable candidates. So this is more informal recruitment. Okay, but there's still some other options. For example, I could look more inside a firm. Maybe I can retrain the janitor in becoming a stormtrooper. Maybe he or she is interested in becoming a stormtrooper. So this is more narrow recruitment. So I'm going to look for specific applicant characteristics in my search for candidates. But maybe I do not have to search narrowly, but more broadly. For example, okay, women, maybe I haven't considered hiring women as stormtroopers before. I mean, the New Order did it in the new Star Wars movies, so why shouldn't I? So looking for more broader characteristics of applicants than you traditionally are looking for. Now, why do I consider so many different strategies in this example? And that's simple, because trying to fill a vacancy is something that's very expensive for an organization. And I looked it up for you, and what we see there is that the average cost an organization has to pay for finding a new recruit is between 4,000 and 7,000 euros. Now, what's included in this cost? First is placing an online job ad. Now, this is between 250 and 350 a month. Okay, that sounds okay. But then imagine you're advertising on multiple platforms at the same time and say for 6 months. So average, it takes about 6 months to fill in a vacancy. Now, hiring an employee is also hard work. It's also not the core competency of most of organizations. So you can also consider letting an external recruitment agency do this for you. We'll also discuss them later. They're called intermediaries, labor market intermediaries. And most of you have come in contact with such an organization, for example, Randstad or Robert Walters. Well, of course, these agencies, they don't work for free. They typically charge between 15 to 25% of an applicant's salary. In some cases, applicants even remain employed with those external agencies, so the organization keeps to pay that external agency. Another way of coming in contact with potential new employees is through career events, for example, those organized by employment offices, student associations, by the regions, or by specific sectors. Now, of course, These seem relatively cheap compared to the rest, but of course they're not free either. Finally, of course, all of the above costs, they do not account for internal costs. That is, for example, the productivity losses that the organization suffers due to the fact of there being an empty vacancy, somebody not doing the work. And of course, the time that is invested in seeking a new employee, because of course, time and money the organization invests in recruiting also has to be taken into account. What is more, if you look at this picture, this amount might be peanuts for large firms. But now imagine that you're a small family firm and you have multiple positions open. In other words, formal recruitment is very expensive, so it's very important to consider how you can do it efficiently and effectively, that is, economically. That formal recruitment is so expensive also explains why many organizations resort to more informal channels. I think most of you have also heard or read on sites like LinkedIn that most jobs are filled in via networks or via informal challenges. Now, there's even a theory behind this idea, and that's Granovetter's network theory. You might remember maybe Granovetter from some other courses, for example, an introduction on sociology. Now, Granovetter distinguishes between strong ties, so these are your family, your friends, and more weak ties, for example, acquaintances. Now, between strong ties in a network, information is often redundant. That is, everybody has access to more or less the same information. Information you have about unique student jobs, for example, they might be more or less the same as your classmates or your friends have. More interesting, however, are weak ties, because weak ties, they provide connections of your own network to other networks, where these weak ties in turn might be strong ties. So according to Granovetter, actually, you are more likely to get interesting job opportunities, but also find love through weak ties. And he calls this the strength of weak ties. However, is it true that informal hiring is that common and that effective? Well, the power of networking is a bit exaggerated. Now, in reality, informal hiring is far from the default hiring strategy, but it still accounts for about, let's say, 50% of all hires, but not the 85 or the 70% that some LinkedIn posts claim. Weak ties are more likely to land people jobs, but this is simply because people just have more weak ties, and you typically have more acquaintances than friends. But an important drawback of weak ties is that weak ties are less motivated to reciprocate. For example, one of your acquaintances might have knowledge about an interesting job opportunity, but is not necessarily motivated to share that information with you, since you are only an acquaintance. Or simply because the weak tie cannot assess whether this information about this job opportunity is valuable to you or not. So, in reality, the strength of weak ties is a bit overestimated. Okay, so much for Granovetter, but why should we still bother about informal hiring? Well, informal hiring remains a cheap and swift option compared to having to pay around 4,000 to 7,000 euros. And if it brings comparable results to the table, why should we go through all that trouble? Another thing is that many organizations draw on so-called employee referrals. That is, when they have a vacancy open, they ask their existing employees if they know a suitable candidate to fill in that position. They find that not only are such referred candidates more productive, employees themselves, they also value the opportunity to make referrals. When the firm asks if they know somebody to fill in that vacancy, they feel appreciated and they feel they have a say in who enters the organization. Final reason to bother is, of course, that a resume is only a paper. We all know resumes are for a large share image building. They provide some information, but they do not tell the full picture of how an employee is and how he or she is going to perform his or her job. You can hire a very competent person on paper, but end up with a guy that lacks communication skills that are important to interact with clients and lose profits that way. But are referred employees really more productive? As always, of course, there is experimental evidence on that, and that is shown here on slide 11. So on slide 11, we see two studies on informal hiring. In fact, first experiment is one by Palace and Sand. Now, in this experiment, they first hired people for a job ad for a simple task. So they had to monitor flight information. So that was the first step. In the second step, they asked those people to recommend new people. And they also placed a new job ad. So they had two channels now, recommendation and job ad. What it is did is they compared the performance between the employees that were referred and those that reacted to the ad. What did they found? Not only did the referred group did much better on the task, they were also less likely to quit, and they had better resumes than the non-referred group. A similar result emerged in a Swedish study that's done by Hensvik and Kuhn. So they studied hiring decisions that were based on military draft tests in Sweden. So Sweden still has mandatory military service in place, and organizations sometimes use that information to hire new employees. After all, think when you come out of the military service, you're typically young, you do not have much else on your resume. What the researchers, of course, observed is that organizations, they often go for a high qualifications, a high test scores. However, when organizations use employee referrals, they see recommended employees typically also have a high test scores, but lower qualifications. So in other words, they saw that in Sweden, companies that made use of military test scores and referrals created a tendency for employees to recommend people who were smarter than they looked on paper. Conclusion that we can draw from these two experiments is that for organizations, employee referrals contains positive information about candidates beyond what can be deduced from simple resumes. Okay, so referred employees are more productive. But why and when is this the case? And to answer that question, our good friends Palais and Sand did a follow-up experiment. What did they do is they hypothesized there might be three different reasons why referred employees are more productive. First reason was simple selection, so referrals are just simply a better way to identify talented workers. Second one is peer influence, so referred employees, they want to perform because they don't want to let the person down who referred him or her in the first place. Final hypothesis was team advantages, so employees refer people that they have a team advantage with. So the employee who refers and the referred employee together, they have a kind of team advantage. And to test each of these hypotheses, Palais and Sand took a couple of things. First, to test selection, they isolated referred employees from the group. So in this way, the referred employee, they can't let down the other employee, but can also not cooperate with him or her. To test peer influence, they gave frequent performance updates to the employee who made the referral. So that sounds nerve-wracking to me, but so this was to test whether the referred employee would perform more in order not to let the referee down. And finally, to test team advantages, they let both the employee who referred and the referred employee use a chat box together. Now, what did they find? Actually, they find that only selection and team production had important effects on production. So in other words, the referred employees, they were more productive because the referrals were more effective at identifying talent employees, so first, and second, because refer employees were more likely to have a team advantage with the employees who made the referral in the first place. But there is more. Two pieces of important information also came out of this study. First is that they saw that high-performing employees, they referred high-performing candidates. So employees that were referred by more talented employees were themselves also more talented, that is productive. And, importantly also, contrary to Granovetter, referred employees also performed better when they knew the one who referred them well. So strong ties also produced better referrals. However, despite these results, it's important to take into account that employee referrals do not always work better. One example is performance pay. So under performance pay, referrals might not be a good option. Why is that the case? Because performance pay actually incentivizes employees to refer low-quality workers. For example, when you sell cars on commission and you want to be the sales star, you do not want a friend stealing away your profit. So what do? Instead, you refer a less productive friend or acquaintance who is not a threat to your sales. So it offers an incentive to refer a lower performing employee. Referrals also do not work under employee collusion. So this refers to employees that jointly decide to reduce their efforts. For example, if I was lazy at work, I could recommend another lazy worker so we could play ping pong or make walks together during the hours. This is a risk more in bureaucratic environments when the referred employee has a strong tie. So in some, referrals are more effective, one, working on the team with the referrer, when the person is referred by a high-performing worker, and when he or she knows the referrer well, but referrals are less effective under performance pay when employees decide to jointly reduce their efforts. Now, to conclude the part on informal hiring, should firms then only consider hiring referred employees? Well, the answer to that question is no. Why? Because it's simply not realistic to make all hires to referrals. There might not be enough referrals to meet the needs of the organization in the first place. On the other hand, there might also be ethical concerns involved. If you would only hire through referrals, it would mean there's actually no way of getting in the organization except for knowing someone. And that smells a lot like favoritism. What's better is actually for an organization to adopt a combination of both, but with good screening and higher standards for non-referred employees. So there is a combination of both informal and formal hiring. And that's a good strategy because it helps to explain why both account for about 50% of all hiring. So far, we have discussed the pros and cons of hiring external candidates through either formal or informal ways. However, we can also try to fill in the vacancy internally and look for suitable candidates within the organization. Both again have a couple of advantages, and most of them speak for themselves. First of all is that internal candidates, they might of course know the organization already. So they know the cultures, they know the specifics, and they often possess firm-specific skills. So, for example, knowledge about the administration, company benefits, specific company procedures, and so on. On the other hand, of course, external candidates, they can bring in a fresh perspective, they can bring in new ideas, but also new knowledge and skills. For example, knowing how to work with a PC program that can do the job better. Internal candidates are also less of an uncertainty factor. They're often known by the organization. Organizations know what to expect of internal candidates, while an external candidate is always a guess, is always a leap in the dark. An internal vacancy can also be used as a kind of work incentive. That is, can be used as a reward for good performing internal employees. So promote the good performing employee to another position. Well, of course, this is an opportunity that does not arise with external recruitment. But of course, there are important drawbacks to internal candidates. First is that they create new vacancies. So of course, if you move an employee from one function to another, there is still one function that remains vacant. This is no problem with external candidates, of course. There's also the risk of candidate complacency, so internal politics. Employees might prefer one internal candidate over the other, or an employee might decide not to apply when a friend is applying for the same position. So an internal candidate is not a guarantee that the best internal candidate will get the position. Finally, there's also a limit to the number of internal candidates that you can have, and hence also the talent pool that you are fishing in. While of course there is no theoretical limit to the number of external candidates and the talents that they possess. So in sum, should we hire internal candidates or external candidates? Well, the answer to that question is actually similar to the question on formal versus informal hiring. It's simply not realistic to expect to fill in all the vacancies internally. Better is to adopt a combination of internal hiring and external hiring. So that is to start with an internal pool of candidates and later supplement it with external candidates, if necessary, of course. And indeed, in practice, we see that most organizations, they use a combination of internal and external hiring, but they also adopt a bias against outsiders in doing so. That is, there is a substantial preference for an internal candidate unless an external candidate is substantially better. And this is also something that researchers see when they compare the resumes of internal candidates and external candidates for the same position. They often see that those external candidates, they look substantially better on paper. They have substantially better resumes than the internal candidates. Okay, so now as an evil lord, I know that there might be some advantages and disadvantages to both formal and informal hiring, as well as to internal versus external hiring. However, of course, in order to finalize a hiring strategy, some practical issues remain. For example, a simple question like, how many people should I interview out of a pool of hundreds? Because, of course, interviewing takes time, and time is money. And if I use a job ad, is it better to be general in this job ad or to make a very specific job ad? Because, of course, we do not want to put off potential good candidates that do not fully fit the picture. Now, all of these questions are examples of optimal scope of search problems. So cases where organization has to choose between doing a narrow search, so focusing on the number of candidates, or a broad search, so considering a wider applicant pool. Let's first maybe turn to the first question. So how many people should we interview? This depends on three parameters. So first is, of course, the costs of interviewing a candidate. So these are the hours and wages that go into interviewing, but also the hours and wages that go into conducting a background check, or even paying the transport of the candidates. You might be surprised, but indeed, it happens sometimes. It can also depend, of course, on the certainty you have about applicant quality. So this refers to the dispersion of talent in the pool. Sometimes there is a lot of variation in the talent of candidates. So then, of course, interviewing an additional candidate might be useful when you're still not sure about a candidate. But on the other hand, of course, when candidates are more simple, it might not be useful to consider interviewing another candidate, because when they are more similar, you're more likely to end up with a similar candidate. It might not be worth the effort of conducting an additional interview. The third parameter, it depends on our skill requirements. Now, organizations typically search broader for higher skill jobs than they do for lower skill jobs. And this has two simple reasons. So first, high skill jobs, they already pose a constraint on the size of the pool. For example, if we look for a medical doctor, then we need at least a medical degree. So we're only searching in the narrow pool of people with a medical degree. Second, and more important, is that high-skill jobs are worth more for the organization. These are people who perform more. They are worth more to the organization. So it's worth more for the organization to invest more time looking for talent to fill in higher-skilled jobs. Now, in practice, we know that most organizations, they stick to about more or less 10 interviews per position. And this is something to keep in mind next time that you'll be invited to an interview. It means you're at least one of these lucky ones. This is also something that is reflected here on the following slide. So on slide 19, this figure shows the relation between the number of interviews and the quality of the skills they possess. So as shown by the dotted line below, which each interview your costs rise gradually. But of course, this doesn't mean that your quality keeps on rising. And now I'm looking at the top two lines, which represent two skill levels. So what we see is while costs rise gradually, quality actually stagnates. So there is a saturation level with larger numbers, and much quicker when there is not much variety in skill level. So in other words, you can, of course, keep interviewing people, but that does not necessarily mean that you will end up with more talented employees in your pool. Of course, we can make it a bit easier for ourselves in the first place by devoting sufficient attention to the job ad. For example, if we're looking for a new economics teacher in a school, we could consider specifying that applicants need to have a master in economics. Now, this is an example of a targeted strategy, so where we specify specific credentials beforehand. However, we need to realize that doing so, we are also fishing in a much smaller applicant pool, and we might maybe miss out on very talented lecturers in, let's say, mathematics or English. They could also potentially be excellent economic teachers. So it might be better to adopt a broader strategy and not specify such credentials. In fact, such broad strategy might be better when there is, one, a low productivity gap between people having the credential and people not having the credential. So returning to our teacher example, having a master in economics does not necessarily say something about your teaching skills in se. So an English teacher with an interest in economics might provide comparable, if not better, performance as a teacher of economics. Second parameter when a broad strategy is better is when applications are scarce. Now we know there is a teacher shortage in the Netherlands, and we also know the Netherlands is not alone with this. If applications are scarce, then you cannot be picky, so it's better to look broad. And the final reason for choosing a broad strategy, so similar to, you will see these are very similar to the choice of how many to interview. First is, of course, what is the processing cost of an application? If it's a low cost to process an additional application, well, then it's maybe better to formulate a broad job ad that will generate a lot more applications to choose from. If you are uncertain about the applicant quality of economic knowledge among teachers, for example, then it's maybe better to formulate a broad strategy as well. So in that case, we attract talented applicants with good didactical skills also in other domains. So if you're uncertain, it's also better to look broad. Final parameter is if skill requirements are high. Now suppose that a master degree in economics is mandatory to be an economics teacher. Now we find ourselves in the same situation as scarcity. We can't be picky in this situation because we're again fishing in a smaller applicant pool, so it's best not to introduce a lot of new credentials on top that will further narrow the pool. In reality, however, we find many very specific job ads. And this leads some people to joke that you need at least an Olympic medal and a Nobel Prize to be able to find a job in today's environment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a little Easter egg from my side. I present to you Philip Noel Baker. What is special about this man? He's the only living person to have had both an Olympic medal and a Nobel Prize. So no matter how awesome you'll end up being in your life, you'll never be half as awesome as this guy. Okay, but return to our recruiting strategy. So, now that we have learned about the ingredients of an optimal recruiting strategy, the applications are in, it's time to test our potential stormtroopers. And of course, we know there are different tests we can subject them to. And I also trust most of you have experience with some kind of testing as part of the application process. For example, cognitive ability tests are very common, so where you need to finish a row of figures or numbers. There's also personality tests, and often this is the non-scientific Myers-Briggs test, so with the different letters. But part of testing could also be, for example, checking up on social media. So make sure this is locked away and there's no contraband on that. Now the book is very American in this sense. It also mentioned drug tests and credit scores. And I think unless you're going to be a stockbroker or join the military, you're probably never going to be subjected to that kind of tests, fortunately. Of course, testing, for the sake of testing, it's neither cheap, it's nor efficient. So there's a couple of criteria that determine whether a test is actually economically worth it or not. First of all, of course, the test has to be cheap to administer. So then I'm not only talking about money to the organization, but also in terms of the burden or the cost it places on employees. For example, if a test is very intrusive or asks a lot of time of employees, like for example, some companies, they expect you to come like 1 day a week just for testing or joining all kinds of simulations, well, maybe it's not worth doing that to your applicants. Second, of course, the test has to be accurate and actually predict something. Otherwise, we might end up with hiring a low-quality applicant, a type 1 error, or not hiring a high-quality applicant, so a type 2 error, similar to statistics and the null hypothesis. Third, the test has to be valid. Measure something that is relevant to the job itself. Now, if you want a good economics teacher and our resources are limited, then maybe, of course, it might be more economically to stick to economic knowledge over testing personality. Fourth is that testing, of course, only makes sense when you expect there are differences in abilities between the applicants. If you place a job ad and the only persons that are responding are idiots, then maybe it doesn't make sense to test them. Then point 5 and 6, they refer to the fact that training is an investment. So it makes more, testing is an investment, sorry. It makes more sense to invest in testing when we either expect this testing to pay off in the long term, so that we, of course, expect employees to stay with us, or when it's hard to fire an underperforming employee. Because when you're stuck with an untalented applicant for long, well, then you're in trouble. If it's easier to fire, for example in the US, where employees are sometimes employed at will, so can be dismissed with a simple "you're fired," then it might be worth the risk of just skipping the testing and seeing where the employee brings you. 7 is that there are alternatives to testing. For example, you can put a couple of participants on a probation period, some kind of traineeship or a trial period. But this might be more of a hassle to get this organized, and a decent test might, in some cases, be a simpler and cheaper alternative, but not in all cases, of course. And finally, number 8, this is not explicitly discussed in the book, but hinted at in the box on civil rights movement, and also slightly referred to it when I talked about the drugs test, namely, not all testing is, of course, allowed by the law. It's important that tests are transparent, that they are ethical, and that they do not harm or benefit one demographic group over another. So heeding this might save an organization some lawsuits and hence some money. But are tests really effective? Well, there is discussion on that, and perhaps surprisingly, there is also not much known about the effectiveness of testing. One of the main reasons this is the case is that most tests are property of testing companies. And these testing companies, they are not so keen on researchers messing with their tests and their results. But one researcher who did manage was Hoffman in 2015. Hoffman got access to the results from a testing company and its results from 15 client organizations. Now what you need to know about these client organizations is that all of these organizations, they had low-skilled employees. They also had high turnover, in fact, a very high turnover, so employees stayed on average 3 months on the job. So HR hell. Another specific about these organizations was that selection was done by HR manager, and their only duty of these HR managers was to fill in the vacant slots, no matter what. Now, of course, in normal circumstances, we expect managers would just follow test scores to make their hiring decisions. But in these firms, HR managers, they had some personal discretion, so they could choose to follow the test's results or not. And in practice, they actually saw that HR managers, they frequently relied on their gut feeling or personal opinion, and they frequently overruled these kind of test results. Now, what did they observe? They found actually that this exception candidates, so where HR managers had overruled the test results, that they had higher turnover, so can you imagine, even higher than the 3 months, a higher turnover than the candidates hired based on the test scores themselves. Now, what did these results show? It showed indeed that a test can have added value in hiring decisions over and above HR managers' gut feeling or personal judgment. However, of course, tests have their value, but there are also important alternatives to testing. And I mentioned already the probation period before. But the first important one is incentivizing employees. Now, if we pay employees according to their performance, so with a variable B, then it's less important to identify employees' talent beforehand. And why is that? It's because they bear the risk of the low performance themselves. So for the organizations, the risk of an underperforming employee are externalized. If employees perform less, well, they will also earn less, so they punish themselves, not the organization, or at least not directly. Second, another idea, as I discussed before, is to have a kind of trial or probation period. And in the past, before the emergence of standard testing, this was a very popular option. So this way it allows the organization to easily test an employee in its natural environment, so to say. If the employee is a lower performer, damage can be limited. So a low performer, then the contract will simply end. So this is a very good alternative when tests are expensive or not worth their investment, for example, in low-skill jobs with high turnover. The third alternative are labor market intermediaries. So I mentioned these in the beginning as well, for example, Randstad, Hayes, Robert Walters. You know a couple of them. Their success is partly explained because selection and recruitment are not a core competency of organizations. So what organizations do is they outsource the recruitment process to specialized companies. And in fact, we see in the Netherlands that about 63% of Dutch companies, of large Dutch companies, they rely on intermediaries to organize the recruitment process. Now, why do so many companies rely on these intermediaries? Well, there are a couple of success factors that explain this. First is that actually intermediaries, they solve a kind of information problem. So they produce unique information about applicants by testing and interviewing employees and selling that information to organizations. Usually they also do this very fast, so before organizations can actually contact that employee and make an offer themselves. Now, side note, and I think it is important to stress, some intermediaries, they are very effective at stealing away applicants from other firms. And an example that some of these organizations will do is they will ask potential job seekers what other jobs he or she is applying for. And they do that to learn about vacancies at other firms, so they can call or contact that firm and propose their own candidate. And therefore, I advise you to be very careful when you get a question by a labor market intermediary like Randstad, what other vacancies you are applying for, because they might trying to fish what other vacancies are out there to propose their own candidates. Now, another success factor of intermediaries is that they often offer trainings themselves. And this again offers unique information about employee skills, for example, the speed at which employees learn, the critical attitude. But training also attracts talented employees that are willing to learn, so it also has a positive selection effect. Another success factor that emerges from research is that sometimes employees, so they remain employed at the intermediary, as I said before, so sometimes employees, they remain employed at the intermediary and they go work in-house with an organization. Now we find that these kind of in-house employees, they are often not only more successful at finding jobs, but they also tend to earn more than their peers in similar jobs. So intermediaries also manage to attract talented employees in that way. Last but not least, labor market intermediaries, they are often founded by experienced employees themselves. So employees who know their way around the labor market. This also partly explains their success. Now, a final important alternative to testing that is often overlooked by organizations is self-selection. We have already discussed this phenomena in some of the previous classes. Now, organizations can induce self-selection by structuring some of the features of the work environment, so it attracts more the kind of employees they desire. And a past example we have seen is the Safe Light study by Lazier 2000. So in that study, if you remember, the introduction of pay for performance led in the long term to self-selection of more productive employees. The example we saw in the last slide is that offering training by intermediaries, they attracted employees that are more willing and more capable to learn. Other examples of self-selection are, for example, offering stock options or simply announcing testing in the job ad, because announcing testing or certain rewards, they can already set a filter on the type of employees that will apply for the job. So sometimes the main value of a test is simply changing the applicant pool by announcing that. For example, if I announce I will test abstract reasoning, employees that know they will do poorly on this test might refrain from applying. An important advantage of self-selection is that it bears actually no direct cost to the organization. But it has a couple of important drawbacks. That is, first, it strongly relies on how employees see themselves. An employee's perception about themselves can, of course, be true or false. If I'm a worker at Lezier, in the Lezier study, I can think of myself I'm a good performer, that I'm good at changing windows, but that does not necessarily make me a more productive worker. Second drawback is that self-selection only provides limited additional information. So in other words, self-selection can only capitalize on information that employees have about themselves. It's very limited information. In that sense, tests, they might be better, they might generate more information than an employee, of course, knows about his or himself. Okay. As a final topic of today, selection and hiring are, of course, only as efficient and effective as long as they don't result in discrimination. Now, what is employment discrimination exactly? Now, it's the use of ascriptive characteristics in hiring. So, in other words, letting hiring rely on personal characteristics that people can't change instead of their achievements or their credentials. Now, in theory, discrimination might be avoided for ethical reasons, of course, but also because it's costly for organizations who have specific tastes. Let's say if I prefer white males, then I'm performing a very narrow search. So I'm fishing in a small pond. Alternatively, if I engage in discrimination, people might engage in lawsuits against me. So that also costs money. So there's an important economic argument to avoiding discrimination as well. It's also important to note that in the Netherlands, discrimination at work is prohibited by the General Law on Equal Treatment, or the Algemene Wet Gelijke Behandeling, which states that everybody is entitled to equal chances in obtaining a job and good employment conditions. Reality, however, is that discrimination does occur, and it often occurs due to unconscious biases or a situation where discrimination is more profitable to organizations. And we will discuss both of these scenarios in the remaining slides. But first things first, how can we detect discrimination? To detect the phenomenon, researchers often draw on what they call resume audit studies. So this is basically researchers making fake resumes where they manipulate some ascriptive characteristics and then send them to existing vacancies. Now, there are a couple of examples in the book, but they are mostly about race, which I think is a very US type of phenomena and context. To bring it closer to home and have also a more broader definition of diversity, I chose two studies by Steen Baert. And these are a study he did on the discrimination of people with Turkish roots and one on discrimination of homosexuals. Now, both studies were conducted in Flanders, so this is the northern and Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. Now, in the first study, Baert sent out 375 fake resumes. Now, these resumes were almost identical, save for the name. So it either had a Turkish-sounding name or a Flemish-sounding name. The results indeed showed that in 29 of the 375 cases, only the Flemish name got a response. So there was clear discrimination there. Fortunately, it only happened in 8% of the cases. They did find there was notably less discrimination for jobs where applicants were scarce. This is, of course, what we have seen before. If you're fishing in a small pond, you can't be picky. Second, and in my perspective, more worrisome study was something Baert did among students. So he did not use real recruiters, he used economic students. Now, these students, they read a kind of scenario about a hiring decision they had to make. And then they were asked to choose which person they would hire on the basis of their resume. Now, on some of the resumes, they put the name of the spouse or partner. And they ensured, of course, that some resumes also had same-sex partners. Well, to some of you, this might sound weird, but putting your name the name of your partner or your children on your resume. In Belgium, that's not uncommon to do so. Now, the results of this study show that when the resume listed a same-sex partner, the hiring probability of that resume dropped by a staggering 31.7%. So this is at least astonishing. So while we can, of course, discuss the external validity, and my perception here would be that Flanders is a more conservative environment than the Netherlands. But more importantly, the general picture here is that employment discrimination, it's a real thing, and it happens, and maybe especially happens in Western Europe. This leads, of course, to the next question. That's why this employment discrimination, like highlighted in the study by Bart, occur. This basically boils down to 3 reasons. First type of discrimination that we see is the result of the tastes of the recruiters themselves, of the employees or clients. This is typically linked to group identification. For example, in the picture here, you can see Zenit player Malcolm. Now, Malcolm is from Brazil, and Zenit is a Russian club. This club is notorious for its racist ultras, so the really big fans. Now, the coming of Malcolm to Zenit sparked some heavy protests from the supporter groups, because in their eyes, a Brazilian player did not fit their tastes of predominantly white players. But discrimination can also be the result of unbiased employee beliefs, and that's more specifically a belief that there is a link between certain characteristics of people and their performance. We call this statistical discrimination. A famous example is, of course, Tilburg is a textile city. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, children were often hired in the textile industry because they had very small fingers, which means they could easily fetch things from under the machines, like loose threads, which led to the positive discrimination of children in the textile industry. Finally, discrimination can also be the result of biased employee beliefs. For example, organization refusing to hire women as garbage collectors due to a belief that they are not strong enough to lift the bags. This is an example of biased employee beliefs. Important, of course, is that employee discrimination is not without its consequences, and the particular consequences of discrimination also depends on these underlying causes of discrimination we have seen here. Now, when discrimination is based on biased employee beliefs or on the preferences of employees and recruiters, we see this not only hurts the discriminated groups, but also risks impacting the organization's profit and its competitive position in the long term. Now, this can happen either indirectly, namely biased employee beliefs and preference that organization has can cause this organization to fish in a much smaller pond. And fishing in a much smaller pond, of course, means they have a higher chance of missing out on talented, that is, more productive employees. But now, of course, with social media and so on, this effect can also be direct. And this is something we see in the example of Microsoft here on slide. The title there states, so Microsoft slide off record high after discrimination and harassment complaints filed by female workers. And we saw this directly had effect on the stock market, on the Microsoft stock. So the message that the organization engages in discriminatory practice today can also, through social media, immediately lead to a drop on the stock market. So therefore, it's also important for organizations to avoid discrimination for economic reasons. So indeed, discrimination based on biased beliefs or preferences, it hurts organizations' profit. But discrimination can also be based on preferences of co-workers or customers. And this is more tricky. Now, in this case, discrimination harms, of course, the discriminatory group, but it can also increase organizations' profit. This is illustrated by organizations that hired black people in the south of the US during the 50s and 60s. Now, during that time, the Jim Crow laws were in place that actively sought the segregation of black and white people. Now, some of the organizations back then, they of course did hire black people, but those organizations often faced threats, they faced sabotage, and they also lost clients, so they also lost profit. So this places, of course, these organizations with a kind of ethical dilemma between staying profitable on the one hand and engaging in discriminatory practices on the other hand. Finally, when discrimination is based on statistical discrimination, we see it increases profits as employees are, of course, matched more efficiently to jobs, but it still hurts the discriminated group in a more psychological way, that is. Now, when employees will be discriminated against, they are likely to invest less in developing their talents. They're also more likely to act in accordance with how others see them. And we call this the stereotype threat effect. And it's closely related to two other type of effects that we see in literature. That's the Pygmalion effect and the Golem effect. So the Pygmalion effect states that employees respond better to high expectations. So when leaders have high expectations of employees, those employees perform better. Its reverse is the Golem effect, that we see that leaders that think less of employees also urge employees to perform less and act in accordance with this perception. Since employees under statistical discrimination do not invest in their talents or do less invest in their talents, and that they tend to act in accordance with people's discriminatory perceptions, organizations, of course, they risk losing profits in the long run. So statistical discrimination raises short-term profits, but over the long term, it risks decreasing profits. Knowing the consequences of statistical discrimination, what can we do about it? Now, to avoid discrimination and its effects on organizations' profit, there are three things we can do. First thing we can do is we can change the decision environment. Second we can do is monitor recruiters. And the third thing that we can do is adopt blind recruiting strategies. We will discuss each of them in the following slides. So first is changing the decision environment. Now, from previous courses in psychology, you might know that people have two cognitive function systems. So on the one hand, they have a more intuitive system, so this is system 1. And on the other hand, they have a more cognitive system. Now, of course, when people have more time, when more resources, they use the more cognitive system. When people's resources are drained, when they are in a hurry, when they are under pressure, they're more likely to resort to the intuitive system. Now, research shows that discrimination often happens when recruiters are tired, when they are under stress, and under time pressure. So this causes them to rely more on intuition and quick decision-making than on hard cognitive processing. Now, this is also something important to remember when you're applying for a job. So it's better to have a meeting with a recruiter in the morning or after lunch than just before lunch or just before closing time when the recruiter is either hungry or its mental and physical resources are more drained. You can, of course, try to change this decision environment. For example, you could try to give recruiters more time to come up with their decision, or alternatively, you can do a mindfulness intervention. Now, recent research done with master's thesis students at our department, so this was under the guidance of Marloes van Henge, they did an experiment all together, and they showed that if they did a mindfulness intervention, it significantly reduces the discrimination that recruiters engaged in. Because mindfulness, of course, it restored awareness, so the recruiters here in this situation, they resorted more to their cognitive system. Second option we can do is we can monitor recruiters. How can we do that? We can, for example, check up on their hiring decisions that they have made over a certain period, whether they have resorted to discrimination or not. But of course, we have also need to keep in mind, remember last class, control can also reduce trust and can also backfire. So be careful with that option. Another alternative is to reduce the discretion of recruiters. So this is also something we saw here during the experiment with the test results and the discretion of the recruiters. If we leave the decision more to objective criteria like test results, or if we even leave decision to intermediaries or technologies like algorithms, then maybe discriminatory practices are also reduced. However, if you leave decisions up to algorithms, this also has its drawbacks. And this is something Amazon found out the hard way. Now you can look at the YouTube video. I'm not going to play it now. But it basically boils down to the following. Now, Amazon wanted to train an algorithm for the selection of potential candidates. Now, you might know that an algorithm, in order to make it effective, you have to train it, you have to feed it data. And they did this by giving it the resumes of its current employees and let it search for potential new candidates. Now, of course, since most of the employees there are male, most of the resumes they also fed to this algorithm were also male. So unintentionally, they actually trained this algorithm to start looking for male candidates. So they actually trained the algorithm to be biased, to engage in discriminatory practices. So the algorithm was quickly abandoned. An algorithm can also engage in discriminatory practices. Final thing we can do is we can adopt blind recruiting. So, for example, anonymous application procedures. I once applied for a job, for example, where there was a test and everybody was assigned a number beforehand. So all the applications, all the test results would be processed anonymously. However, empirical results for this type of recruiting, they are a bit mixed. There's a couple of examples here on the next slide. So first study, a study by Golden and Rouse, they found that during auditions for orchestras, if they did this behind a screen, so anonymously, it increased the number of women that were hired on this orchestra. But actually, this is not something they find in every study. For example, in a study by Behegel et al. In 2015, they found actually the opposite. So they found that anonymous applications, they actually reduced the number of minority candidates that were hired. Why was this the case? It was because the organization, they already engaged in a kind of positive discrimination. And actually, putting an anonymous filter on that, it reduced the positive discrimination effect and reduced the number of candidates from a minority background. Another experiment that found a drawback of anonymity or partial anonymity was a study by Dolak and Hansen in 2016. Now, they did a study on hiring people who have been in prison. So people who come out of prison and they want to reintegrate in society, they often have a hard time finding a new job. So they observed, what if we let people anonymize their prison past? Now, this called this ban-the-box policies. So for a certain time, people who had a prison past, they did not have to put this on their resume. Now, what they saw, if they put this part of the resume out, it actually led to less hiring of people from Black and Hispanic backgrounds. The reason behind this is anonymous applications, they remove some pieces of information. This causes recruiters actually to go and focus more on other pieces of information to make inferences about the candidate themselves. So in this case, removing the prison information, it actually led recruiters to focus more on the racial aspect and see this as an indication of prison past. Because of course in the US, people with a Black and Hispanic background, they often represent a higher percentage of the incarcerated population. Now, what did we learn today? First, we learned that it's better to look at both formal and informal challenge for hiring employees. That it's better to start with internal candidates that we later supplement with external candidates. However, in doing so, firms should apply more strict criteria to both formal and external candidates. We also saw that tests have their value. They can be more accurate about employees' talents than pure judgment or gut feeling from HR managers. We also saw that organizations, they engage in discrimination, and while in some scenarios this can create short-term profits, in the long term this is almost always the case that it leads to losses in profit. Why? Because organizations restrict to a smaller pool of talented employees, because discriminated employees don't invest in their talents, because they act in accordance with their stereotype, and because organizations can also face potential lawsuits. Finally, discrimination can be avoided by changing recruiters' decision environment, monitoring recruiters and by blind recruiting, but especially with regards to the latter, the effectiveness and practicality of these strategies depends. It's a bit on the situation probably, and is also subjected to discussion. That's all for today. So that being said, I'll be available tomorrow at 10:45 for your questions, so during the normal course hours. However, if you have a question in the meantime, you can, of course, always send me a mail. Have a happy belated King's Day, and I hope to see you next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the economies of training. Thank you very much, and see you.